Hello and welcome everyone to our event today, our session webinar to the end game and beyond. I'm really pleased to welcome you all and also really pleased to welcome members from all around the world. My name is Leah Evans and I'm the Deputy Chair of the Pensions Board here at the IFOA and also an actuary at Mercer, specialising in risk transfer and pension risk management. I'll keep my introduction to this topic brief because I know the speakers have got a lot to say, but I think suffice to say that we all know that this is a huge topic. We have huge numbers of schemes who will have to be run off over the next few years, and although lots of us are spending a lot of time with our clients talking about this, there's still no firm industry consensus of what's exactly the best solution. How do we help clients decide? And so I really welcome the work that this working party has put together and this comprehensive report with a really good summary of the current position and some useful suggestions. Now, before I hand over, I just want to introduce today's speakers, who are a subset of the working party. Firstly, there's Kostas Yassoumi. Kostas has extensive experience across both pension consulting and working in insurers, offering bulk annuities and longevity swaps through pension schemes. He is the chair of this working party and has also previously chaired the Running Off Mature Schemes Working Party and also the IFOA Bulk Annuity on Longevity Swaps Interest Group, and has been a member of other working parties. Jane Kohler is a lawyer and has almost 30 years experience of advising trustees and employers on their workplace pension arrangements. Jane helps clients understand their risks and how to manage and mitigate these, finding the practical way forward. And we're really pleased to have non-actuarial input in this working party and the presentation today. Nigel Jones has been in the pensions industry for around 25 years and is currently head of pensions advisory at Broadstone. And he has also sat on a number of working parties for the IFOA. Dwanisha Kalichan is an actuary in EY's pensions consulting team and works across all aspects of pension risk transfer. She's been heavily involved in building EY's solutions in this area and has advised on all sizes of pension schemes. Adolfo Aponte is a managing director at Lincoln Pensions, where he advises trustees, corporate and financial institutions on covenant matters, including corporate transactions and funding de-risking structures, and he leads Lincoln's Covenant Risk Transfer team. Brianne Littlewood is a qualified actuary with 10 years experience in the pensions industry, mostly spent as a consultant advising pension schemes on all aspects of their endgame journey, and Brianne has recently moved into the insurance world and now works for Phoenix Life. Kevin Westbroom is a professional trustee with Capital Cranfield, having been a consulting actuary with Aon for over 40 years. He's been involved with many different strands of pensions, investments and broader employee benefits. And Dan Mikulskis is an investment partner at LCP. He's a lead investment advisor to institutions like pension funds, wealth managers and sovereign funds. So that's all the introductions done. And as this is such a broad topic, what we'll do today is that the team will give us an overview of the main sections of their paper, and Kostas will be guiding the discussion between the speakers. So we'll probably have around 50 minutes or so of presentation and discussion between the panel before opening it up to questions from the wider audience. And now we all know the power from these sessional meetings, even if we're not all in the same room, really comes from having some interaction and input from you in the audience. So we would really welcome questions and comments from you as we go along. Now, a few final housekeeping points before we get started. You'll be able to submit questions and comments throughout the webinar in the Q&A box on your screen. And you'll also be able to like a question or comment that someone else has posted. And we may be able to the team may be able to pick up those questions as they go along, or else we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. Now, today we're also trialing a raised hand feature. So if you would like to pose your question live, then please raise your hand and there's a button on your screen. And then you'll have the opportunity to briefly be promoted to speaker and ask your question. You have the option to keep your camera off if you would prefer, but you will need to keep your mic on. And please be sure to introduce yourself before asking your question. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded, so your questions will be recorded as well. Now, I hope we'll have lots and lots of questions today, and we may not be able to answer them all during the session. If not, then we'll send them to the speakers afterwards, and they will follow up with answers after the session. And finally, if you have any technical questions during this session, then please don't use the Q&A function. You've also got a chat with moderator function where Gemma Smith from the IFOA events team will be able to help. And I'd also just like to thank Gemma and the IFOA events team for setting up and facilitating today's session. So with all that done, I'd now like to hand over to Costas and the team for the paper. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Leah, and good afternoon everybody. I'm going to steer us through the presentation with help from the co-authors. So without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Gemma, can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm not sure how the animation looks for you there, but in effect, the Mission Impossible heading here highlights that endgame planning is such a huge topic that there was always the risk the working party would struggle to get to a conclusion. The backdrop was that as a profession, we needed extra thinking to help advising actuaries guide their pension clients to a suitable target end state. Given the multidisciplinary nature of the topic, it was essential that non-actuaries were involved, and so we're delighted that the working party included individuals with legal, corporate finance, covenant and trustee backgrounds, as well as actuaries from across pensions, investments and insurance. And so what we'll talk about today is the framework we've developed, the target end states that can be applied in practice to real cases. Can we have the next slide, please? So we've allowed 50 minutes of presentation, including addressing your questions as they come up. As Leah mentioned, please post the questions. Once we've finished presenting, we'll also open up to the live speaker facility. We'll stop periodically as we speak to hold polls to hear from you on a live basis what you think about our recommendations, including the topic of this headline from press coverage shown here today. So we can move on to the next slide. Let's start the discussion with defining what we mean by target end state. After all, if you're not crystal clear about when you've got to your destination, you may end up somewhere completely different. Kevin, as a working party, we toyed with different terminology for the end. Why did we settle on target end state rather than other phrases like endgame?
I pay myself the first pound for you're still on mute. Excellent. I think there's two parts to that, obviously. The end state, the end game, we're all familiar with. We know that we've passed the magic 50% tipping point now for UK private sector schemes. So over half of them are now closed to future accrual. We are in the running off of the UK DB pension system. I think the target part is perhaps the more interesting one, because a lot of schemes know that they're doing something like this, but they haven't formally adopted it as a target. A target is all around carrying out the intention, the purpose behind it. And I think what we're trying to convey here is that increasingly schemes will have to start to crystallize their definitions of what they're trying to achieve, whether it's the three on the left-hand side of the slide or the two on the right-hand side. That they'll have to be more specific, more well-defined about the whole process that they're trying to target, and much more certainty around it.
And I mean, I guess the buyout and super fund end states, I mean, quite frankly, I'd say they're end games, because once you execute them, you know you're done and dusted. The low dependency one is different. So can you talk a little bit about that one? Because it seems to be a continuum rather than an actual end.
Yeah, it may well not be the ultimate end state in that sense. So in that sense, it could differ. It's not a transaction. It is an ongoing process that says you will run the scheme on. This is the state formerly known as self-sufficiency, or various other things, low dependency, low resilience, whatever else. I think one of the key things that we've discovered as we've been through the working party is just how vague this phrase was. If you'd asked people what it meant, you could get funding definitions from gilts minus to gilts plus 1 to 1.5% even. So it's pretty badly defined. And I think that's one of the key things we're trying to encourage people. If you commit to low dependency, what do you actually mean? What funding targets, what investment philosophy, what residual risks are you going to be running, and how are you going to address those? So it is conceptually different. It may be a stepping stone as well. It may be you're in low dependency, but an opportunity for buyout or super fund transfer comes up and you switch your target end state. So to that extent, you're right, Costas. It's a different position to the other two.
So we'll come back to that one at the later on. And does buyout always give the best member outcome?
Yes, a bit of a leading question, which sort of summarises the whole of the work of the working party. I think all I'd say at this stage is, if you are in buyout, if you are going to get to buyout, you could argue that you have delivered the members' benefits with 100% certainty. We could have a discussion about whether the insurance regime could ever collapse, financial services compensation scheme wouldn't pay out, or whatever else. But for practical purposes, if you're into buyout, you're 100% certain of delivering members' benefits, which I think is the definition of success. The real trick is, can you get to buyout before some of these other things happen to you?
Okay, so we'll touch on that, because if we can turn over to the next slide. I mean, as a working party, every time we discussed end states, we always came back to the same things. And one of those was, what are the legal obligations on trustees? Therefore, we felt we had no choice but to address legal aspects at the start of the paper. Jane, a TPR publication last year said the following: the PPF's experience is that scheme benefits are usually incorrect, and the necessary work to put them right more often than not results in an increase in liabilities. Is the PPF being harsh on pension trustees here?
I don't think it is being harsh, Costas. I think the experience we have is that trustees have, over the last 20 years, not invested in what their liabilities really are. They've relied very heavily on the administration systems delivering the right benefits without actually a basis for knowing that's correct. And that's common across all schemes. I suppose the schemes which go to the PPF are the ones that often have struggled the most with their budgets to invest in their schemes because of their sponsor situation. But I think most schemes don't have a benefit specification that a lawyer has looked at, or if they do, they only have it because they are about to go into the insurance market to do a buyout, not because they feel they need to look at it before then.
Okay, so PPF wasn't being harsh. To build on Sorry, Jed. So to build on the question I asked Kevin earlier about buyout, I mean, we discussed whether buyout has to be the target. Our trustees are obliged to target buyout, because if the answer to that was yes, I guess our working party paper would be very different. It'd be more about how can trustees achieve buyout. But I understand there's nothing in legislation that says buyout must be targeted. Is that true? Are trustees obliged to minimise risks, or do they have actually quite an open piece of paper there?
The legislation doesn't require the trustees to have any target beyond getting to their technical provisions basis for funding purposes, which we all know isn't buyout unless the trustees with the agreement usually of the employer to achieve that. So there's no statutory requirement to get to buyout. I think something else that isn't understood is that trustees are allowed to take legal risk in terms of determining what they're trying to achieve, just as they take risk in other areas. So it's more about trustees understand consciously the risks that they're taking and then making conscious decisions, having balanced the issues, rather than sort of walking into risks and then not really, having to then firefight to deal with them. So trustees who've thought about where they want to go, what's in their members' interests, what their sponsor can afford to do, are the ones that have a plan that looks at the contingencies, looks at the risk they're running, and then manages that over a number of years, rather than responding to events, which is quite often what trustees do.
Okay, so really trustees need to think quite carefully about what their rules say, what members will get from the scheme, and then decide on the target. I mean, I suppose another party in this is the employer. I mean, is there an example you can share of where specific powers of an employer can impact the target end state?
I mean, I think the key one is in most schemes, the employer decides who the trustees are. And whilst an employer can't appoint trustees to do its bidding, it certainly can appoint trustees who, acting properly, have a similar view of the world to the employer. And if that is a low dependency world, that's perfectly legitimate. I suppose the other one to think about is that even if the trustees really want to get to buyout, they can't force an employer to pay the contributions necessary to do that. They have to agree contributions in the statutory regime, which doesn't have the objective of, and that too can influence the position, because if you can't get the money, then by definition you're going to have to invest your way there in some respects.
Okay. So given what you've said and all the analysis we did on the legal side as a working party, I mean, do all trustees have a balance of powers paper on their desk from their scheme lawyers? Because it seems essential to me.
Some schemes do, although it's usually very high level and usually has very little to do with the benefits that are payable. I say the majority don't have that, just as they don't have a legally signed off benefit specification either that says what benefits are due. Most don't have discretion policies, so they're not actually entirely sure who agrees to what discretions. They tend to do things on a sort of hit and miss basis. I mean, to be fair, there are some schemes that are incredibly organised and have all of these things. The majority are not there yet, in my experience.
Okay. So if we now move on to the next slide on covenant, I mean, the concept of covenant was introduced by TPR some time ago. Most of us will be familiar with putting sponsors into one of the 4 covenant groups, CG1 at the best, CG4 at the worst. But one of the things that struck me about covenant is that regardless of how well funded a scheme is, even a scheme that's 100% funded on buyout depends on covenant. Rodolfo, can you explain why covenant buys time?
Certainly. And Costas, as you pointed out, I think the industry since the 2004 Pensions Act has focused quite heavily on the rating, the underpin that the covenant provides to funding and investments, as well as its ability to provide cash flow to the scheme where a deficit is identified. Less focus, however, has been put on the interaction it has with the trustees' own strategic objectives. The reality is that, as we found out as a working group, covenant does have a material impact on the strategy that trustees will be putting in place. And that kind of boils down to, for most schemes, if their employer fails, they will end up having to face one of 3 options, usually. The first one is being forced to go into an insurance contract. If funding levels are above the buyout requirement, then all benefits are covered. However, the other 2 options, which is probably the 2 options that are most relevant to pension schemes in the UK right now, are one of getting into PPF plus territory, i.e. not having sufficient funding to cover all benefits, but having sufficient funding within the scheme to cover benefits in advance of or in excess of the PPF, or entering the PPF as a third option. I think importantly, if a lot of schemes have focused on improving their funding position, de-risking their investment strategy, but the reality is that if their employer fails along the way of delivering their objectives, then they could be facing one of these two options.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is that most schemes that have a reasonable funding level, given enough time, can invest their way and deliver member benefits in full, regardless of whether or not they get additional funding from the employer. However, if the employer becomes insolvent, that just calls time. You're no longer into a long-term journey. You've basically got a short-term horizon, and then you fall into one of those three options.
That's exactly it, Costas. And the reality is that regardless of how well funded the scheme is, in most cases, the employers, the driving force for the employer will be independent to the pension scheme. So if for those schemes out there that have a weak employer and are looking to rely on that employer for 5 or 10 years, then there is a non-negligible risk that employer will get into some level of distress over that period of time.
Yeah, and we'll come back to it later, but I've seen plenty of other work that basically points out that there's a huge number of schemes, measured 1,000 or more, that will never make it. Their employer will become insolvent before they can secure members' benefits in full. So this is not a trivial issue.
That's it, and we're seeing it play out in the headlines of national press in recent cases. And given the economic reality we're living through right now, we expect that to tick up. So I think it's a very relevant topic for trustees. They're turning their attention to setting their.
Okay. Right, well, let's move on then to the next slide and start thinking about the target end state. And Dan, I mean, the phrase long-term objective, it already been coined. So why didn't we simply use that as a working party? Why have we come up with our own term, target end state?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it, Costas? Thanks. And I think just a quick point on wording, I guess. I mean, I think what we realize is the words and phrases that you use throughout this do matter. They do influence how you frame things and how you think about things. But you do have to be a little bit pragmatic. I mean, as actuaries, we love to go through and just redefine everything and come up with a whole new set of definitions and nice new acronyms for everything. But that isn't that helpful. So I remember the conversations we had. We sort of weighed this on a case by case. Is there actually a strong enough case for introducing a new name for this thing? If not, then let's align with what's being used. And here we did think there was, I think, and it was for a few reasons, I guess. We wrestled with this idea of having buyout, consolidation, and low dependency as three things, and they're obviously not the same. Two of those things are a transaction that you hit and you can say when you've done it, and the other one is a much more of an ongoing kind of state. So that was one issue. But another one is that the state we felt was a higher order thing that sat above the objective. So the objective could be something to do with funding, could be something to do with investment. But the actual state you're in kind of sits above that and kind of incorporates that sort of within it. So, and one of the issues we found was a lot of this is focused purely on funding objectives, which are an important component of the target end state, but don't come anywhere near describing the fullness of it. I think that was sort of the reasons we decided to try and introduce something new.
Yeah, and I like these 6 criteria that were prepared because they make it a lot more real. When you've got there, when you've achieved it. And I guess one of the challenges for us as an industry is that trustees don't define very specific target end states, just something very woolly, which isn't very helpful in terms of building journey plans and as a management tool.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think things have got better. It's probably important to say that. I mean, a few years ago, maybe it was dominated by to pay the pensions when they fall due, which is the most vague of all objectives. I think that's been replaced more and more with funding targets for the long term, which is great. But as we said, funding is just one part of it. And also often trustees are reluctant to actually put in writing a buyout target, even if that is the real target. So a couple of issues there kind of preventing these being defined in the way we sort of felt they should have been.
Yeah, and one of the things the Working Party did, which we won't cover today in the interest of time, but we have tried to provide wording and context to help produce quite solid definitions of what the end state is, regardless of what the choice of end state is. Number 5 on the list, prescriptive in terms of investment policy. What do you mean by that one, Dan?
Well, that came from the fact that oftentimes if you define something in terms of a funding objective, which is, in my experience, a lot of trustees will say our long-term objective is to be fully funded on gilts plus 50 basis points. That's saying nothing at all quite often about what the investments are doing. Whereas an alternative way of thinking about it, if you were to sort of say that the investments had to be in high quality bonds, that you're then being very prescriptive. So there's this question of how prescriptive do you want to be on the investment side? It feels like your target ought to say something on investments, but then we also felt that you didn't want to tie yourself down too much because this could be well in the future. So you don't necessarily want to pin yourself down to investing in a certain type of bond or whatever. So that was a real variable there that I don't think is debated anywhere near as much as it could be.
Yeah, so I guess a little bit like, in simplistic terms, maybe thinking about the investment side rather than starting from the discount rate and trying to fit an investment strategy around it.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, yeah, that's the classic chicken and egg thing, isn't it? What comes first, the discount rate or the investment strategy? And I'm not sure the answer to that is, but quite often that's the thought process you go through. It's like, okay, we're funding on gilts plus 50 basis points. So what does the investment strategy need to back that? Or did that come out of the fact that someone had an investment strategy in mind and back that out of it? But I think it's important to unpack that and get to the bottom of that little sort of dilemma.
Okay, so let's jump to the next slide on low dependency. We spent quite a lot of time on low dependency. It was the first of the end states we considered, and there's a little bit of a definition there from TPR. But again, just to challenge again, surely, why isn't, for example, gilts plus 25 basis points good enough? Why did we draft pages and pages on low dependency?
Yeah, well, it's a good challenge, and it's not the worst starting place. Let's be honest. I mean, I think that it's reasonably decent. But the trouble is, as you probably picked up from what I've already said, that definition is silent on a lot of really important things. And from my perspective as an investment consultant, it's silent on what the investment strategy ought to be. And a lot of, based on industry surveys, about 40 to 50% of all schemes are targeting this end state. So this is really relevant for a huge number of schemes. And a lot of schemes are getting to that point where they're actually making decisions on investment strategy where they kind of need to have a clearer idea of what that ultimate investment state needs to be. For example, presumably it's investing in bonds, but what kind of bonds? Do you want to sell all your equities and buy bonds or leave some equities left? What about your property? What kinds of bonds? Do you allow global bonds? Do you allow high yield bonds? How high quality do they have to be? Are we looking to match cash flows entirely or not? What about longevity? Are we assuming a longevity swap or not having a longevity swap? So all of those questions, I think, you end up going back to saying, well, what are we trying to achieve here? And if your objective only says to be fully funded on gilts plus 25, you haven't come near to answering any of those questions.
Yeah. So it's more describing in effect the whole scheme, the whole operation of the scheme. What will it look like when we're in low dependency? And there'll be some big ticket items like investments, but there'll be things like what will the administration of the scheme look like? What might the trustee board look like? What risks have we hedged? What's our member options strategy? Everything. And that means you've got quite a complete definition. You know when you've got there and you can work towards it.
Yeah.
Is it worth just touching on one of those measures? In the paper, we've given 3 alternative forms of low dependency as a way of illustration. I mean, the probabilistic one, do you want to just say a few words on that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this grew out of the fact that the traditional way of you can specify a funding target, that's the traditional way of doing it. You could then go ahead and specify an investment strategy alongside that and specify the other things. Or you could sort of step up a level and say, well, could we define the target in terms of saying deliver the pensions with 95% certainty sort of thing. And the nice thing about that is it incorporates the joint funding and investment policy within that. So that allows for a range of investment strategies and or funding policies, but bringing them together gives you sort of 95% numbers. So it's a nice way of bringing a lot of different variables together without having to define them all separately. There's a lot of modeling around the industry now that sort of allows you to do that, albeit that has disadvantages in terms of complexity and assumptions that you have to make. But it's also quite it's quite clear and quantifiable, isn't it, for trustees? So some advantages and disadvantages to it, but we thought it was worth putting on the table.
Yeah, I really liked it. Rhian, I mean, you've recently moved to work at an insurer. I mean, if an insurer had to set a target end state, would it go about it in the same way as a pension scheme?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it would be a bit different, partly because insurers start from a completely different point. So there isn't really a concept of recovery plans in the insurance regime. So I'd say the way that insurers tend to work is probably closest to the probabilistic approach to low dependency. And I think the key point there is similar to the point that Kevin made earlier, that low dependency doesn't represent a firm endpoint. It's a state that you've got to stay in, and you've got to actively look to stay in it, which is part of our recommendations that schemes should also do that. The other real difference, I think, in the insurance world is that insurers don't tend to hold the minimum required assets in order to meet these, whatever definition of low dependency that they choose to use. There's always buffers and margins in there, which is something that pension schemes perhaps don't do so much.
Well, let's move on then on that theme to the next slide. So Kevin, who spoke earlier, he was quoted in the Pensions Press, I think was it today, as follows: "There's nothing wrong with gilts as long as you're prepared to vary the plus. Why are you going to stick with the old gilts plus some fixed number? Why don't you look at what your investments are telling you about what the plus ought, rather than the number you used last time?" Denisha, is there anything wrong with taking discount rates to gilts plus a fixed percent?
Well, in short, I guess for low dependency costas, the answer is yes, and I'll explain why. As Dan already mentioned, historical common practice was to discount pension liabilities at, say, gilts plus a fixed margin, so gilts plus 50 basis points, for example, which meant as a scheme matured, the overall funding basis would just tend towards this figure. And this was broadly consistent with an investment strategy of investing in those high quality secure bonds, notionally or not. But in a low dependency state in particular, it's not just about the investment strategy. It's about the joint and more rounded view, perhaps, of funding, covenant, and investment strategies that work together to deliver the member outcomes. And very importantly, at the same time, not creating excess funding level volatility. And to achieve this, you could perhaps instead align the discount rate with the actual yield on the portfolio. So basically moving to an approach which is gilts plus floating, as you mentioned, gilts plus variable margin instead.
So basically what you're saying is you, especially for schemes that hold some form of CDI strategy, you can just get the yield and then that's your TP's discount rate?
Yes, so the floating or variable margin is adjusted dynamically to reflect the returns on the actual asset portfolio. And so basically the dynamic discount rate changes through time in line with the asset portfolio. And as I mentioned, it results in a much smoother funding position through time and less variability as well in the deficit reduction contributions which get paid. So basically, it just helps you to more closely match your assets and liabilities and remove those artificial funding volatilities that you may get otherwise.
No, that's great, yeah. And one of the questions that was asked by email in advance of this was around this topic, which I'll just answer now, which was the variable discount rate doesn't actually impact the liabilities? And the answer is yes. The liabilities, as Jane explained, are to pay the pensions, but the factors in life, what gets measured gets done. And if you have artificial volatility in the funding level, then that can impact. Rhiannon, that sounds quite straightforward, variable discount rates. But I understand that for insurers, determining and maintaining a variable discount rate is a task for an army of actuaries. Is that true, or can most pension schemes just adopt this type of approach if they see fit?
Yeah, no, it's completely true that there's huge investment, expertise, manpower, resources that go into this, and insurers can generally afford to do that because they've got longer term time horizons in many cases, because they're not looking to perhaps buy out in future, and also the buying power and the economies of scale to make sense of it. And so it is effective. It does result in very stable solvency position when it's done properly. But I think big question about whether it's realistically within the reach of most pension schemes.
Okay, yeah, so I guess if a scheme wanted to adopt a variable discount, especially one that maybe gave a discount rate higher than the ones under the new funding code, once it's settled, they want to go down the bespoke, CPR might be asking, okay, what expertise are you applying here? So maybe let's move on to the first of our polls just to get some reaction from the audience. So poll 1, which I'll read out, so hopefully you can see a poll button on the side. Actuaries should press trustee boards to take legal advice on their powers under the scheme rules and on the detailed benefit entitlements of members. Do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? So if you click on your poll button, you can address that and we'll see the live results. Well, I think we can stop that there. Jane, if you're still on the line, just very briefly, I'm personally astounded at these results. I thought there'd be many actuaries who wouldn't be too comfortable pushing trustee boards on this, but it seems to me that the consensus is really important and that actuaries should take a bit of leadership here. What's your perception?
Yeah, I think that actuaries do want to push for legal advice, but some of their clients push back pretty hard. And I think collectively, if actuaries agree that generally there needs to be collaboration in respect to benefits, that more clients will accept that. So I think it's useful to see the poll as this strength of view in respect of it.
That's great. Okay, well, let's go on to the second poll before we go back to slides. So this one's really asking the question, should the profession sponsor research into using dynamic discount rates? This was one of our recommendations. What do you think?
Costas, while people are voting, there's also an interesting question coming on whether dynamic discount rates can be extended to cover equity investment. It's definitely not one for me to answer, but one of the people that know what they're talking about might want to pick that one up now.
I suggest we park it unless someone's got the answer, and it can be answered in less than 1 minute. But it's a very good question. So, I guess looking at the poll results here, I think the consensus again is we would welcome more work done in this area, maybe including that into that question as well, because as schemes mature, there seems to be some support here for dynamic discount rates. So maybe we move on back into the presentation and just talk about member outcomes. I remember the horrors before the PPF was formed, when employer insolvency I mean, some real horrific stories. I mean, members really lost all of their benefits, maybe just a few months before pension age. And in that context, the PPF has been a great success. But Nigel, in a nutshell, what does PPF entry mean for members?
Yeah, thanks, Costas. I agree with you. I remember the horrors back in the day where members received very little of their benefits, and there was nothing they could do about it. But if you look at the graphic, the clear implication is that members will not receive full benefits under the PPF. And these can range from as low as 40% of the expected benefit up to nearly 100%. So the outcome, whereas it's reduced under the PPF, it's still likely to be considerably better than had the PPF not existed. So remembering the horror stories of the past, I think PPF entry could be viewed as a reasonable second prize. Okay, maybe a third prize, but we can come to that. You know, if I look at the pattern of the chart, though, many of us will already know under the PPF, deferred members receive 90% of expected benefit or expected pension, and pensioners receive 100% of expected pension. But more importantly, members also use lower than expected increases in the PPF as compared to their scheme benefit. And it's these two features, Costas, really that create the pattern in the chart. You know, quite simply, those at younger ages have longer exposure to lower PPF.
Can you generalise? Is it possible to generalise? Because it just seems to me here there's such a wide range of outcomes. Yes, older do better than younger, but it must be tough, you know, as a trustee to understand how your different member groups are going to be impacted.
Yeah, I mean, we can generalise, and generalising the pattern does hold true. Those people at younger ages do worse as a rule because of their longer exposure to the PPF benefit. But if we look at our median value, it does put our member outcome at around 70% of expected value. And I think that's a good yardstick, because if you go back to one of the points Kevin made, buyout, you could say, and ignore employer solvency risk and FSCS and all of those pieces, but you could say that buyout value is 100% of expected value. The median value under the PPF is 70%. I think that gives you a good yardstick. Now, the value is obviously modified by scheme specifics, and most notably scheme increases. And then you can see some large spreads at each age, because those schemes that pay the larger increases are the ones that are most affected. And you see a bigger member loss under the PPF. But I do like the sort of general yardstick of 70% of expected value under the PPF, 100% for buyout, and then maybe something in the middle when we get into the other regime.
Well, let's skip over to super funds on the next slide. I mean, it seems to me that where benefit cutbacks are a real possibility, trustees should be asking how they can get the best outcome for members, even if no outcome offers complete certainty. I mean, there's so many moving pieces for pensions. Any one of them can wobble or fall down and change the outlook for member outcome. I mean, although it's possible to generalise, member outcomes are very member specific. How can trustees make heads or tails of what's in the best interests for their members?
Yeah, the answer, Costas, is, as you may expect, is it's very difficult. Lots of moving parts, time, covenant, legislation, different products, and I think, and one of the things we've discussed as a working party, it's really about the assessment of the member outcome and with the information you have. And the bottom of the slide sums this up well for me. You know, it is all about the assessment of that member outcome. And if you look at super funds, for instance, super funds can rely on less capital than insurer buyouts. So essentially, scheme assets should go further from a simplistic point of view. and one should be able to increase the likelihood of a higher benefit outcome for your member. And again, assuming full buyout is not affordable. So back to the thinking of the previous slide, if the PPF delivers 70% of expected benefit value and the buyout is 100% of benefit value, then one would expect the super fund to sit somewhere in the range. Indeed, it could sit. Sorry, Cos, go on.
I was going to say, I mean, given all of these different possibilities, I mean, one thing as a working party, we really spent a lot of time on was member outcomes, because it was felt that to make informed decisions, these outcomes need to be properly modelled. And although using experience and generalisation, it is very helpful. Outcomes, modelling those at a granular level gives extra insights and also allows maybe easier communication and decision making by trustees. So let me go through a couple of member outcome examples and we can pick that up in a little bit more detail. So we can flip over to the next slide. The way to read this slide is as follows. On the left-hand side, if we look at the orange line, this shows the cumulative probability of an employer failing over future years. So you've got years on the x-axis, and you've got the cumulative probability on the right-hand side y-axis. So you've got a probability of failure, cumulative, 30% by year 8 and 45% by year 12. I think we can all agree that the better the funding level at the time of failure, the better for members, a generalisation. Now let's look at the right-hand side chart. Rather than focusing on funding levels, let's focus on the proportion of pensions secured for a specific deferred pensioner. So the green dots, they show the proportion of pensions secured if a prudent investment strategy is adopted and the employer fails. So we can see that for this deferred pensioner, their proportion of pensions secured increases from 50% to 60% by year 4. That's a massive 20% better pension, and that's going to be far more than the average for the scheme. By year 12, we get a sudden jump because the trustees here have decided to go to a super fund. But there's a 45% chance the employer has failed before they get to that position in year 12. The red circles show the same proportion of pensions secured, but in the event of the trustees adopting a higher risk and higher return strategy. What we can see is that they achieve the super fund funding level by year 8, and there's only a 30% or so likelihood of insolvency before then. The black circles show the 1 in 20 downside with the higher risk investment strategy, and we can see for this member the outcome isn't actually much worse than what the low and more prudent investment strategy would show. For this trustee board, we're not suggesting they adopt one investment strategy over another, but without looking at member outcomes for different specific cohorts of members, it's very difficult to make an informed decision. And if we move over to the next slide, our second example, member outcomes, what this shows is that the weighted or expected proportion of pensions met for 2 schemes, but with different employers. One has a strong employer. If the trustees make their investment strategy and funding basis more prudent, they get additional employer funding. And in the unlikely event of employer insolvency, the members are better off, the scheme's better funded. The position is different for the weaker employer. If those trustees adopt a more prudent approach, yes, they will get additional funding, but in this case, the extra strain on the employer increases the probability of failure, and overall members are worse off. I mean, Kevin, given these sorts of member outcome examples, surely trustees have always considered member outcomes in some detail?
I think they have cost us. I think they've probably considered them at sort of a generic or an implicit level. I think what these examples are starting to illustrate is you need to get a lot more explicit and a lot more numeric about member outcomes. So this example here suggests that a lower investment strategy, lower risk investment strategy, which we would typically all applaud, actually, if all that does is increase the duration over which the scheme is exposed to sponsor failure, and using Nigel's numbers, instead of getting 100% of their benefits, members drop to getting 70% of their benefits, overall, it's probably not going to be in members' best interest. So that's a very different sort of approach to a different sort of thinking than we've been doing before, because it introduces explicitly this whole idea of long-term covenant.
There's always going to be trade-offs in this sort of analysis, and you know, I suppose it's a little bit of damned if you do, damned if you don't. In some situations, it's a matter of looking at what's in the best interest of the members as a whole, just recognising that some members may be impacted different from others. But if we wanted to take this member outcomes to the next level, I mean, what type of modelling are we thinking of? Are you thinking of? What types of metrics?
I think we're talking around the sort of stuff that both Dan and Nigel have been mentioning, sort of stochastics long term. But the key thing is now to explicitly put in there this possibility of failure of the sponsor. You put that into an asset liability. So you've got assets, liabilities and covenant being run over a potentially quite long period of time. And then you're pulling out this key statistic. How many times or what proportion of times do members' benefits get paid in full, or typically the actual, not just a simple count, but actually reflect the severity of failure. Doesn't matter if you've got a failure, to be honest. If you've got a 99-year-old pensioner who's got most of his thing, misses out on 1 year of final pension, let's put that into this metric. Total proportion of pensions paid, PPP, lovely. Nobody's ever used those initials before. It could be very straightforward.
It must be challenging. It's not easy. It must be so model dependent, the assumptions. I mean, I had quite a look at the work that was done. You know, the TPR's commission, some words, has obviously done a lot of thinking on this, on super funds. You know, it can't be easy.
No, it's not. You're right. You're highlighting some of the technicalities that we're going to have to get to grips with, and also the answers. You know, if somebody turns up and says my scheme's got proportion of pensions paid is 96%, what do? Give them a pat on the back or say, God, that's 4% failure. That's dreadful. We haven't yet got as a group. We don't quite yet know where we should be or where we want to be, or if moving from 90 to 91 is worthwhile doing something. So we haven't got that sort of confidence yet, I think, as an industry, that we understand what these numbers are, let alone explain them to potentially not just trustees and sponsors, but also why not explain them to members?
We really need to get to that. I mean, the example I gave earlier, where that deferred pension is sort of 20% increase, the pension they would get on employer insolvency just over 4 years. I mean, that's massive for them personally. That's massive. But yet some of those older men, the 99-year-olds you mentioned, they may see no increase in benefit because then they're worse off or better off under the PPF.
Absolutely, you're quite right. You know, you could take this analysis and then make it more granular. Don't just do it don't give me the scheme score, but break it down into different cohorts and different groups of membership. But you also alluded to one of the things. This is potentially quite difficult sums we're getting into, let alone the assumptions. Key one of which is going to be insolvency probabilities. As actuaries, we're going to have a field day with working out what the probabilities are. We should be talking to people like, the covenant advisors to really help us there. But we also need to recognise when you're at the 98s and 99%, you're at the tails of distributions. You're not in the middle of a bell curve. You're right at the extremity. Are you sure your calculations or your assumptions are actually robust enough there? So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I do think it's going to be necessary to give best advice to people in navigating their end states.
Okay. Well, we'll pull the events shortly on that. So if we can move over to the next slide. So as a working party, we spent a lot of time figuring out how to bring together all the different components into a coherent way to derive a target end state. And in the end, we settled on a 5-step process that we think can be applied to most situations. We're not claiming it's the only way, but it is a way. And importantly, in our view, perfectly placed to act as the hub to help clients pull all of this together to develop their target end state. The niche in step 1, we say that target end states may not be in. Can you give an example there?
Yes, so Costas, I guess circumstances for different schemes obviously very different. The obvious example I would give is perhaps a buyout. They could be achieved in the short term for some schemes, but not others. And I think it's important for trustees to have a realistic and robust journey plan. So, for example, a target end state of buyout in 40 years' time is not a very realistic plan. Equally, if you're targeting buyout in 5 to 10 years' time, but the scheme is only 50% funded, this is not very credible or realistic. Neither. But I think one point to make as well here is that a target end state needs not be forever. For example, it can be reviewed periodically as well and adapted and changed as circumstances change. So more like a staging post rather. And there can be just more than one journey plan as well, or options within that journey plan.
Okay. And so in effect, one's on the table. More realistic ones, give different parameters in play, and you work through the steps. So, in step 2, rates that might rule out.
Yes, I guess for me, an obvious one is size of the scheme, which restricts the solutions available to them. So, for example, let's say longevity swaps. At present, as we know, it really makes sense for the largest schemes, so half a billion plus. So that could be a constraint. Sometimes employers and trustees also have conflicting constraints to consider, and something many of us have come across is accounting impact of a buy-in, for example. So is that going to be OCI or P&L impact, which is more of an employer consideration? But for the trustees, this is not high up in their agenda at all, if they're at all. They'll be more concerned about covenant of the insurer, maybe.
Okay, so I suppose a mixture. So, the small scheme, we did a question on this, and the scheme's never going to have enough economists from a low dependency. So that doesn't make step 1. Step 2 might be the may see some quite material impact on its financial statements buyout, which might mean buyout, might mean the timing of buyout is impacted, or it may even mean buyout on the table. I guess that's just something to work with clients. When you work all this through, you get step 5. Would you expect to see a unique and best target end state, or are trustees again just going to have to take a view, having on an option, and who knows if it's the best?
Yeah, it's a mixture actually. So you could very well end up with more than one target end state and more than one journey plan at play in step 5, and this is where the trustees, with the help of their advisors, actuaries, covenant, investment specialists, perhaps even legal advisors, would need to consider which one to select. And there's going to be trade-offs, but I guess the most important point here is that these are made on an informed basis. So it needs to be on a rationally derived target and state. And what comes here as a leitmotif is that theme of member outcomes, so keeping member benefits at the heart of it. And as I said, also just bearing in mind that it doesn't need to be that ultimate final state. It can be just a stop in what might be a multiple stop journey, and you could perfectly end up with a plan A and a plan B as well.
Okay. Yes, I guess that member outcomes bit, it really helps illustrate where you got it down. You've got 2 or 3. Trust these member outcomes and just make that informed choice. I mean, you've given an excellent cue onto the next slide, which is about Plan B, because we've already mentioned that things can go wrong for a pension scheme. They might not go according to plan, and consequently, there's no point focusing only on the plan. I mean, can you just describe what we mean by Plan B?
Yeah, so Plan B is pretty much that backup plan. It's that contingency plan. And I guess the current COVID-19 situation as well makes it a very relevant example of how even very well-developed plans can be thrown, of course, and the need to also consider other potential scenarios that might vary from that expected course you've charted out. And as
we've not had that many insolvencies despite COVID. I mean, come on, preparing a plan B for events that are unlikely to happen, surely it's a waste of time. I mean, Rianne, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm with Janisha. I don't think you can live through this year without seeing some value in having a plan B, and particularly on the focusing in this scenario in planning for target end states. There's so much which could change at such short notice. We heard earlier about the importance of covenant, for example, and the fact that you might think you have many years to get there, but if your employer's covenant weakens suddenly, that might suddenly change, and you need a plan B to avoid making decisions in a rush or in a difficult situation and get into some suboptimal decision making.
Yeah, and I guess if you have a plan B, it may even impact how you implement your plan A. I guess looking at that as one of the points, which is you may have a plan A, but the way you deal with it might end up actually jeopardizing or making your plan B more difficult. And again, that means there's a bit of a trade-off for the trustees. In the interest of time, let's jump to the next poll here, which is member outcomes. We've had some comments on this on the questions, and I'll look at these as we go through the poll. I mean, should actuaries champion the use of member outcomes analytics to assist client decision making, or do we think we're actually already in a good place on this? Do we need more analytics? Kevin, it's I mean, you were quite hot on member outcomes as a working party member. I mean, there's only 6% who disagree with you. Oh, it's gone up to 12 now, but you must be quite pleased with this.
Yep, that is good to see. There have been quite a few questions coming in. Please feel free to answer them, fellow members. Quite a few questions pointing out some of the practical difficulties here. My 95% example, does that mean I always get 95% of my benefits? Or do I only get my benefits 95% of the times and 5% of the times I get something horrible?
Yeah.
So,
we just need a common lexicon, don't we? We can't be talking cross purposes in the industry on those sorts of things.
Well, very good point. We need to get to some consistency and commonality so that we can help others, so we can genuinely help not just the decision makers, but potentially even members when we start publishing this to members. That'd be quite a scary thought.
Okay. Well, let's go to the next poll, which is hopefully all about Plan B. So, schemes should develop and understand their Plan B in the event of employer distress or insolvency. Strongly agree, down to strongly disagree. What do you think? Yeah, Adolfo, do you want to comment on this? I mean, a lot. I strongly agree. I was surprised at this. Adolfo, are you happy with this?
Exactly. And I think this is a response to some extent TPR's increased focus on in-game planning. I think if you ran a similar poll a few years ago, I think covenant wasn't thought through as a key driver of these decisions. But I think the more the industry matures and the regulator turns its attention to this, I'm not surprised at all these results. And if anything, it just presses the point and making sure that our trustee clients understand the importance of this factor.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think just having your fallback, I think it's just common sense. I think it's great. And whilst we're on that topic of Plan Bs, maybe we go over to the next slide, which is about stress schemes. And I mean, this movie clips from the excellent 1983 movie War Games. We've spoken about the Plan B, but to develop your Plan B, you need to be aware of the issues in running a scheme that has a high likelihood of never making it. By being aware of those issues and rehearsing the what-ifs, holding those war game scenarios, scheme can be quite well versed in their options. Nigel, in a nutshell, what is a stress scheme?
Yeah, I mean, Costas, there's several things to consider, but essentially a stress scheme is one that is poorly funded and has a high likelihood of employer failure, and that's the difficulty. So there is a benefit for schemes and members for keeping schemes going, because keeping a scheme going gives you a shorter exposure to the PPF, and that will ultimately improve the member outcome. So,
well, let me stop you there. Jane, PPF drift. Can you tell us about PPF drift?
Well, my next point.
I think the audience probably has more experience of calculating PPF drift than I will ever have, but it is that increase in the cost of the liabilities to the PPF as members retire. The more people get to the pension estate, the more it would cost for the PPF to cover those benefits, because the compensation is higher or can be. And that's an important question for the PPF and the pensions regulator, although I'm not sure it's necessarily that important a question for trustees until they're actually outside of ever going into the PPF, because they're better funded than that. But nonetheless, It does come up.
So really, to build on that point and where Nigel was heading to, I mean, basically what you say is that for a scheme that's under 100% funded on the PPF, members' interests are enhanced if the sponsor remains solvent, so the scheme can just keep running. Even if the sponsor is in a zombie state, you have to buy time.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I mean, the PPF and the pensions regulator may not necessarily be that keen on that situation, but it's not gaming the PPF for a scheme to just continue as it always has and its sponsor has struggled on. Gaming the PPF is different than that, and there is no obligation on the part of trustees to treat the Pension Protection Fund as a beneficiary in respect of their scheme, but absolutely have to look after the interests of the members of their scheme, and time improves their position as long as they're not propping up their employer in a artificial way.
Yeah, and I guess that's a question which I'll come back to in a moment about legal structures in this area, because I think it's connected with SWOS's schemes without a substantial sponsor. Nigel is a SWOS.
Yeah, essentially, as you say, Costas, it is a scheme without a sponsor. So the covenant has almost disappeared, and you're relying on what is left. Clearly, a SWOS to carry on running in a closed state will have the benefit of some form of funding level that is above the PPF level of benefits. And the trustees of the SWOS then can decide what to do with that. And whether you're a SWOS or an ongoing scheme, as the funding level increases, so do our options and the ability to push up the expected value of that member outcome, whether we're looking at reshaping benefits, member options, or super fund stroke buyouts. But it's all really, for me, hinging on the level of the funding in that scheme. It has to be at a reasonable base level.
So in effect, the sponsor becomes insolvent. Normally, you'd have a PPF assessment process, and the scheme will either end up in the PPF if it isn't well funded, but if it's quite well funded, you'd have a PPF plus buyout. What we're saying here is that for schemes that are sufficiently large, that have a decent funding level, they could possibly arrange their affairs so that even if the normal sponsor becomes insolvent, they can continue running. Is that, I mean, Jane, should trustees, should they be setting up legal structures to become SWOSs?
The trustees do often have the ability to do this with the help of their sponsor. The question is whether it is in their members' interest to do so. And for some schemes, the trustees may well take the view that it is in the members' interest to buy that extra bit of time. They might be so close to buyout and feel they have the sophistication to get to buyout without their sponsor that they do put a blocker in to prevent that PPF plus buyout. The other scenario I've seen as well is where there is other covenant elsewhere in the world, but it's not willing to be associated with the scheme directly, in which case a SWOS approach can be a way of getting more money in, which you otherwise would not get. And then that also gives a good reason to do it. But I don't think trustees should put these structures in place lightly. They have to be completely satisfied they're in the interest of their members in what is a very difficult situation to operate in.
Yeah. I guess also links into dependency. Sorry, Nigel.
Yeah, I was just going to say it is a difficult position to be in. The other factor, though, is the efficiency of capital. You know, I think with the introduction of super funds and those other solutions, you may be able to use capital more efficiently, and that definitely gives trustees thoughts on whether to proceed along the SWOS route, because you could be more efficient.
Yeah, and I suppose linked into that efficiency point, it links into low dependency, because I guess if you reach a low dependency state, that means, well, I expect to be able to run off the scheme with minimal or no reliance on the sponsor, but we've still got this legal reliance. You know, as Adolfo said earlier, the sponsor buys you time. So it seems to me that this might be intricately linked into a more robust form of low dependency, because you wouldn't want your employer insolvency to suddenly call time when you could otherwise have run the scheme off, meeting benefits in full, because you've got your investments, you've got your longevity hedging, you've got your funding in a good place. I mean, Adolfo, is this part of Plan B planning?
As a covenant advisor, it certainly should be. I think what we're talking about really is the fact that as we look at the various risks that a scheme faces, interest rate risk, inflation risk, longevity risk, there are tools out there to try and hedge those risk factors completely or partially. But when it comes to covenant, there are very few options that are in the trustee's control to actually hedge your exposure to the covenant. As we've noted before, that is relevant for most schemes out there, regardless of their funding level. So I think it's recognizing that I think up to now, I think the industry has managed covenant risk as something that is completely out of control of trustees. Whereas in reality, I think one of the things as a working group we're highlighting is the fact that actually for some schemes out there, those schemes that get proper legal advice and kind of advice from various stakeholders and engage with the regulator, you know, this may well be an option for them.
Yeah, and this chapter that we drafted, I mean, it was revised quite substantially, and it was really helpful to get feedback from TPR, PPF, and DWP on the paper. I mean, what are TPR's and PPF's expectations here? Is it pick up the phone? You know, how would you summarise those?
Good question, and as you say, we've gone through a bit of a journey on that chapter, and I think we started the chapter noting the fact or requesting additional guidance for all schemes in this area, because ultimately, you know, we recognise the point that Jane has highlighted, the fact that, you know, whilst trustees can't game the PPF, they're not there to kind of protect the you know, the position of the PPF. So that left trustees in a slightly awkward position to try and navigate through. By engaging with, you know, the PPF, TPR, and DWP for that matter, I think it was clear that, you know, they have been giving this area some thought. And in reality, they pointed us in the direction of the Superfund, the latest Superfund guidance, which notes that any actions which put in place, you know, employers or SPV-like employers should actually be thinking about this in that context, and probably engaging with, you know, the legal advisor, but also with TPR before putting them in place. And I think it's an area that, you know, again, Costas, you may have to add here, you know, that they're looking to, you know, further develop and communicate with the industry on, given its relevance to some of the schemes and the business cycle we find ourselves in.
I'm sure TPR won't want, but I can't speak for TPR, but won't want thousands of SWOSs floating about. But I think for, you know, well-funded pensions, well run, that have locked down the risks, that have got the economies of scale, I mean, this may certainly improve member outcomes materially. I think it's definitely somewhere as an industry we should spend a little bit more time on. So let's move on to our final poll. We've spoken and touched on various facets of our paper. I mean, one thing that's come through is the actuary and the profession can be at the centre of this. Do you agree that the future role of the actuary is going to be pivotal here in helping trustees bring all these different components together to develop the end state? Please click on your poll button and let us know what you think.
Costas, while we wait for the poll to come in, just a quick reminder on time, if you can then wrap up quite quickly so that we've got a little bit of time for questions. Though I note that the chat has been very interactive, so thank you all very much for joining in.
Yeah, I mean, any questions we don't address on today's event, we will address them separately. So we've had a huge number of questions. So, I mean, Dan, do you want to comment on this one? I mean, it seems a very strong consensus. Actuaries are well placed here, but we probably need to get on with it as well.
Yeah, a hugely surprising result here. Actuaries feel they're brilliantly placed for this sort of role. But yeah, I mean, I think it was worth saying that. I think it was worth saying that explicitly in the paper. And you know, the point that I think we were trying to make is it's actually quite a different role. It's all very well to say, actuaries are well placed because we're in the middle of things, but this is about strategic thinking. It's about being a decision-making coach. It's not about calculating stuff to 5 decimal places anymore and defending specific sets of assumptions, discount rates, and stuff like that. So it's actually quite a big shift, and you know, I think that's something that people can hopefully start to internalize and take forward.
Okay, thanks. So if we put up the final slide, which I won't run through, it's a summary of the 8 recommendations. I mean, Leah, shall I hand the reins back to you and we can pick up some of these questions that have been posted, and presumably we can also open up the live speaking option, although in time we might not have time for that.
Yeah, great. So thanks all for you know, really good discussion, and like I said, thanks for the interaction on the chat. Just a quick reminder, if you do want to put your hand up and ask a question live, then raise your hand and flag that to Gemma. Probably only have time for 1 or 2 of those, if at all. But let's pick up on a couple of the themes that we've had, and a lot of the questions have been addressed. One theme that has been coming up a lot is the assumptions and the models, and I personally agree that looking at member outcomes is a really useful and valuable addition to what we perhaps do, and more relevant than just funding level. But as we've seen from the comments, there's clearly a lot of issues around what are the assumptions that we use, what are the parameters that we have that in any modelling, what's the interaction between contributions and employer failure. Do we risk trying to over-engineer something that then ends up being so reliant on assumptions that actually it isn't that much more worthwhile than what we do already?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I'll just jump in there. I've said this a couple of times in the chat, but I come back to that famous quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So the aim here is not to be right. The aim is to be useful. So I think the extent to which the modeling outputs are useful, then it's worth doing. It's not about arguing whether they're right or wrong. In terms of the assumptions, of course, it's very sensitive to a whole range of assumptions. And one thing I think we felt that the profession could perhaps do was have a voice in what reasonable ranges are for those assumptions, perhaps, I don't know, act as a sort of a clearinghouse for different sets of assumptions. So at least consumers of that modeling could test the assumptions their advisors used against something that's deemed to be sort of reasonable.
I think that's a good point, Dan. You could even take that to its logical conclusion. Why don't we ask TPR to set the modelling assumptions that should be used to predict member outcomes? Let's reinvent the MFR through the back door. One of the things on the chats that's come up is the question of long-term covenant modelling. Perhaps not surprising, Adolfo, but actuaries are saying, covenant advisors, can you do your projections as well as we can do ours? Paraphrasing slightly. Observations on that?
Kevin, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think the reality is, and PPR has picked up on this, when the exposure a pension scheme has to its covenant is usually to a single name, to a single credit. It's not to a portfolio of corporate bonds, which is where you can use probabilities of default to drive, results. I go back to I think the good response from Dan, though, that ultimately here what we're trying to do is try to help people think about the consequences of one decision over the next and get the intuition right. Because as we've pointed out through this conversation already, there are some counterintuitive aspects in there that I think the industry hasn't faced directly, and we could definitely do a little bit more of.
Thanks. And as a follow-on from that point on assumptions, another theme that's come up in a couple of questions in the chat in advance as well is around the size of the scheme. And there's a few different aspects to that. One is, what solutions in terms of super funds, buyout, etc., are scalable for the smaller schemes. Similarly, for the smaller schemes in particular, there's probably a discussion of how much do you spend on modelling. And thirdly, as raised in the chat, for the smaller schemes, idiosyncratic risk is particularly important as well. How do you suggest that smaller schemes address this area? Is there anything that they should be doing differently?
I mean, I can say a few comments on that. I think for smaller schemes, I mean, there's definitely a challenge in terms of what target end states might be in play. And although there are some consolidation type options out there that give access to big scheme solutions, smaller schemes, they can only go so far. So things like fiduciary management, DB master trusts, they all help. But I think realistically, especially once you allow for the expenses of running a small scheme, realistically, the only end game may be either buyout or transfer to a super fund of some type. With the plan B planning being around what happens if the employer defaults, which will be either PPF or PPF plus. I think member outcomes can still be modelled for a smaller scheme. I don't think that's an issue. It's just that you're going to have more volatility potentially in how that unfurls over the future, because just a smaller scheme inherently has more volatility in its funding level. But I think there is a sense of proportionality in all of this.
And I think you mentioned a couple of examples, Costas, where as an industry we have taken concepts and descaled them and downscaled them so that they can be applied. Fiduciary management, liability management exercises. We have got a reasonable track record of actually making solutions downwardly scalable. But it will be a challenge to get some of the thinking, and it may be that it is only through those consolidation vehicles or something that those small schemes genuinely get access to the best thinking in some of this area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Then there was a question on the chat for Jane that we haven't answered by Rob Evans. If a scheme was able to get to full buyout but then decided to continue to run off, could the trustees be criticised for that?
I think it depends on the reasons why the trustees were doing that, and it's also very rule specific. I think generally the majority would see their objective is to secure the full benefits as best they can within the insurance market, because that's currently, as we see it, the safest place to be. But there are schemes which have rules that mean that trustees could justify carrying on. But I don't think the majority are in a position where they can justify trying to carry on and try perhaps to get surplus for improvements rather than just buy the benefits that people are entitled to. I think those schemes are few and far between. So it may be circumstances where it is possible, but in most cases I suspect trustees would find it difficult to justify.
Okay, thank you. We had a question in the chat mentioning of a scheme is only a side issue and the funding position is the only one that's taken note of. Can the regulator do something here to raise the profile of the solvency position? I think there's probably a question over to whether we would want the regulator to do that, or more generally, do you think the regulator should be doing more on the various things that you've been doing? Do you think we need any additional legislation?
I mean, there's some areas we've highlighted where we think it would help to have more. For example, in the area of SWOSs, has been very clear about what the expectations are there. Because it just seems to be this sort of twilight zone of some schemes looking at this and not looking at this, and quite often it's driven by the trustees board's appetite to maybe just go that extra mile for the members. And that's one I would definitely highlight, because it just feeds so much into the plan B, especially for the larger schemes. I don't know what my co-authors think in other areas.
Right. Well, I think sorry, Jane, did you want to make a last point?
I was just going to say that if TPR could actually help everybody by pointing out that trustees do need to understand what benefits they're supposed to be paying. They don't tend to say that very often. They talk about data, they don't talk about entitlement. And I think it would be good for all of us if TPR was clearer that it's not just the data, it's all of it that needs to be considered.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll draw it to a close today then, but thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you to all the team presenting, and thank you very much to everyone participating in the chat. It's been really interactive and great to see so much involvement. So thank you for joining in, and please do follow up with us with any further questions.